to be recording this event, just so you know, which is another reason why we ask you to just keep your cameras off. So thank you so much. Okay, so I'm Sari. I'm the Public Programs Director of Mofad. Some of you probably know me by now. We have been doing virtual events. I don't know how many months. How many months has the pandemic been? 4 years? It's hard to say. But we've done a lot. So for those of you who have joined us before, thank you for coming again. We so appreciate your support. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, welcome. It's wonderful to meet you. Like I said, I'm the Public Programs Director of Mofad, the Museum of Food and Drink. Normally we are an actual physical museum that you can go in and you can learn things about food and culture, and then you can taste things. But as we all know, there is a pandemic. So our doors are closed for now. We've been doing all of our events online, and it's just been so wonderful to be able to find ways to connect even when we can't be in person. So these virtual events have been just an incredible way to connect with you, maintain community, grow new community members who are all over the world, literally, not just the United States. I've been hearing from so many people, so this is really a privilege to keep finding ways to connect through all of this. Tonight, we are so thrilled to have Chef Marcus Samuelsson talking about his book, The Rise, which he co-wrote with Osayi Endolyn, who we also have. We also have the great Therese Nelson, one of my dear friends and favorite writers and chefs. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about both of them, and then I'm going to pass over to Marcus to kick off the conversation. But just want to let you know there's going to be a Q&A at the end of this talk, the last 15 minutes. So right now, the chat box isn't open publicly. You can send me questions. You can write me privately if you have questions that are just burning inside you. And then the last 15 minutes, I'll come back and help facilitate a Q&A, which we'll use through the chat box. You can type your questions in then. Also, for those of you who aren't super familiar with Zoom, you can watch on speaker view, you can watch on gallery, totally up to you. I usually like to watch on speaker view because it really focuses in on the person who's talking, but again, that's your call. So to introduce our amazing panelists this evening, we have Osayi Endalyn. She is a James Beard Award-winning writer. She has work everywhere, so please find her if you haven't already. Southern Living named her one of 30 women moving Southern food forward, and in addition to other book collaborations, including The Rise, she is working on a narrative about the history of systemic racism in American restaurant and dining culture. We are so excited that this will be forthcoming. We have the great Therese Nelson, a professional chef, a writer, and founder of blackculinaryhistory.com. Go there immediately after this event if you haven't yet. It's a social network created as a way to preserve Black heritage throughout the African culinary diaspora, and the legacy being constructed by Black chefs for the next generation, which is something we'll be talking about this evening. And of course, we have Chef Marcus Samuelsson, the chef behind so many restaurants worldwide. He's won multiple James Beard Awards for his work as a chef and as a host of No Passport Required, his public television show. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he converted his restaurants Red Rooster Harlem, Marcus B&P, and Red Rooster Overtown in Miami into community kitchens in partnership with World Central Kitchen. His newest cookbook, The Rise, is in stores now. That's what we're going to be talking about. Chef, take it away, and I'll see all of you at the end of the program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Sari, first of all, great job, big introduction. I'm so excited that Mofad's missions are living brighter than ever through a very challenging pandemic. So that's, that goes to the amazing work that all of you do as a collective. That's amazing. So. And I want to thank, on behalf of everyone that is part of The Rise, for setting up the stage for Therese and Osayi and myself to have a chat and talk about The Rise. The Rise was really a book that I think can reflect on our journeys as Black chefs, for Black food writers and Black craftspeople in the industry. And it hopefully asks a lot of questions and answers some questions, but one of the main questions is really about we're not monolithic. And this is a very simple idea, but just as much as American history was never written with us in mind, so goes for this food history. So once you start unpack that, you realize it's layered, it's complex, it's delicious, and has many entry points. Whether you deal with a great migration or you deal with immigration, and then how people move and continue to grow. So we talked a lot about that, but we also focused on authorship. There was definitely a need to reclaim and restore our authorship and contribution when it comes to the contribution of Black people into American cooking. Then the second one is really memories. We have to create memories around our food, both orally but in written, but also have non-Black people start to have memories around our food and create a value base that lives within our culture and core, but also outside. And then the last one is really aspirations. How do you create a worth and desire and a value proposition to our contribution? And how do you create aspirations if you haven't talked about authorship and memories and so on? So with that, I would love to talk to or have Osayi open up the floor and talk and explain a little bit about your journey in the rise and all the things that you contributed, because the rise wouldn't have been the rise. It would have just been an idea without several people, but particularly Osayi and Yawanda. Yawanda did an amazing job of developing the recipes, and Angie Moser that did the photography. When you do a book, it's a collaboration of so many different people. And also Mike that really believed in the idea from Little Brown and as a publishing company. So there's many people that we owe thanks, but also the hundreds of chefs that are mentioned in the book. The rise would not have been the rise without all the contributions. So Osayi, would you like to jump in here and take it from here?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about the structure of the book, and thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Sari, for that intro. It's really great to be here. One thing that I don't know if everyone in the room knows is that Therese is one of the people we profile in the book. So in addition to her incredible expertise and breadth of knowledge of Black foodways, she's one of the superstars that we want more people to know more about. And I felt so grateful that you shared some of your family story and your personal journey with me, in the development of the essay about you. So I think that this book was kind of grounded in how do we confine something that's actually incredibly incapable of being confined, or how do we define something that means different things to so many different people? One of the core, I guess a premise that I work from is that Africa, the continent, was never a place of one singular people. The region, West Africa and Central Africa, where so many people were taken and their work extracted over centuries here in this country, were never one people. They never had a singular language or religious belief system or foodways, and there may have been some regional similarities with things that grow, but you see that today in other parts of the world where just because people are next door to each other doesn't necessarily mean that they are figuratively speaking the same language, right? So, in this country, we have sort of been grouped under, as Black people, one umbrella, and that has been a point of a political stance in some ways, and it's also been one of the leading edges of how you continue to oppress people. So, we wanted to really figure out, how do we build on the incredible of works that have classified and documented Black cooking over the last 200 years, which, if you don't have the Jemima Code by another person we profile in this book, Toni Tipton Martin, that's a wonderful volume that beautifully illustrates the long legacy of Black authored cookbooks in this country. But building on books like that and the work of folks like Jessica Harris, who's a close friend of Mofad, we wanted to say, like, what's the current conversation? How do we encapsulate like what Black cooking is today, its many departures, its many inspirations? And so we started with the stories of folks who we felt represented a cross-section, not the, right, but a cross-section of geographies, of experiences, of career choices, of backgrounds, to convey just how widespread and how different people can draw from their cultures and their different interests to express themselves and their culture through food. And from there, we saw, I kind of handed over these transcripts to Yewande Komolafe, who worked from that source material to develop recipes that connected directly to the continent, but also celebrated the individual narratives that are represented in the stories that people told. So this is in many ways a very personal book. I felt that there were stories that people told us that I hadn't necessarily even seen in their own work as writers necessarily, or in previous interviews. And that is a very special thing to notice, because what you're realizing is that someone is trusting you with a portion of their life and their legacy. And that they're entrusting you to make sure that it gets articulated well and accurately. So that's kind of how we thought about making sure that we can celebrate the incredible achievements, but also recognize, Marcus, you said something about, we wanted to help people create new memories around this food culture. But I think I want to just like edge in there a little bit and suggest that, those memories have always been there. They just haven't always been attributed to Black people, right? Because we have always, as Black people, been the cultivators, the harvesters, the cooks, the preparers, the butchers, the makers, everything that is related to food in this country, for a long period of time, started and ended with someone of African descent doing that labor. And so, this book, like so many others in this category of American cooking, seeks to further help readers identify and locate, the authorship, as you said, and also, the acknowledgement, and have that be a tangible way that people can go into their respective communities. And even if you never eat at any of the restaurants by the chefs in this book, there is a touch point somewhere where you live that speaks directly to the experiences and the history that we talk about here. And so this is really a book for everyone that localizes Black food as one of the pillars and centers of American cooking.
So one of the other big important things about the book was also show the pluralism of our work, right? You don't have to only come up through a restaurant. You could, but the beauty about what the ancestors and the generation before us really gave us is when I think about someone like Pigfoot Mary that did street cooking here in Harlem on 135th, right in front of Schaumburg, for example. And then you think about somebody like Sylvia Woods or Edna Lewis or Miss Leah Chase or Alberta Wright. Some of that was restaurant, but some of that was also other cooking, right? And what's important about the book is to show that we hear, but everyone does not work just in restaurants. There are food writers, like we talked about, Tony Tipton Martin, Jessica Harris, but also someone like Deborah Pierce in Chicago that's been the food editor at Chicago Tribune, for example. There are winemakers like someone like Andre Mack, for example. And a lot of chefs goes into private chefing, which is also a big part, and catering, for example. So Therese Nelson, can you tell the audience a little bit about your journey from Johnson & Wales and cooking and the industry to where you are today? I would love to hear you share that with us.
Sure. Thank you all for having me. It's always a good time talking about Black foodways. I like that you talked about authorship because I think for me, it was always this sense of when I was in culinary school, I felt like a guest in the industry, right? Like I felt like I was being told subliminally at the school, especially, and also when I got into the industry, that I was somehow a guest, and it felt wrong. It felt inaccurate, especially when I was early working in hotels, especially, and seeing all of these Black and brown faces, these amazing, especially women who had been in these jobs for 40 years, who had seen chefs come and go, had kept these recipes. I went to Johnson Wells in Charleston. Charleston as a hub for culinary tradition is matched only by a couple cities. And there were these places where these women held these recipes and created this language, this kind of translation of what the Low Country was for this tourist, this gaze onto Charleston in this really particular way. It felt coded. And I don't think that I intellectualized it then, but certainly as I was making choices about where I was gonna house my work, I mean, I always wanted to be a caterer. Honestly, because it didn't feel like there were options for me in restaurants. My personality, where I felt the math didn't make sense in restaurants to me. And also the examples of Black women that I was seeing didn't exist in these sort of rarefied restaurant spaces. But the other part that has always been impactful to me, and one of the reasons why I started my site, was because I didn't know better. Like I knew intuitively something was incorrect about this guest feeling, this sort of visitor feel in this industry, but I didn't have the language for it, and it also didn't have the scholarship to feed back into me, telling me these stories. Right? We talk about Edna Lewis a lot, right? People want to canonize Miss Lewis, and as they should, right? Her book was one of the first books I saw myself reflected back. Miss Lewis is also hella subversive. And she was also someone who understood her presence in this industry in a time where there weren't a lot of people talking, there weren't a lot of people writing. There was not a lot of agency in the ways the stories got told. And so for her to have this book that talked about specificity, talked about a very particular place, talked about this cuisine in a way that elevated it and like revered it in a way that I hadn't really felt or seen, was a game change. And I think, I don't know, there's something particular about this moment where a book like The Rise could exist. Because I think that it's a starting point. It's giving us the opportunity to be more specific and more rigorous about the way we showcase who we are and what we do in this work. It shouldn't be monolithic, like you all said, and it doesn't have to look a certain way. I think there's more about having a room to be fly, right? To express what it is you want to say and do in this work. And the problem is that when there was no gaze on this industry, we had that kind of agency, right? We're talking about, 1810, or when there weren't any restaurants, it was Haitian expats. It was, it was Philadelphia, it was caterers, it was all of these brilliant technicians creating cuisine, but there was no gaze on it, and so there was no authorship. And so I wonder if we are ready to really seize this moment and, I don't know, in a way that defines it and doesn't leave it on the table for someone else to, I don't know, translate or define their own way.
Well, I think that's amazing that you bring that up, because I felt for the years before, every book that we take on takes about 4 years to make. And so, but 2 years before that, the process of what and how, and I felt like the most important thing is to document this journey, because once you document it, it's there, right? And so much about African and Black culture is orally, right? When I look at still to this day, when my wife cooks, she never cooked with a recipe. It's always a ritual that is passed on tribally or from her auntie, her grandmother, her mother. And that is one of the things that has come from us from the continent. Most recipes that we do as Black people are oral. And there's a beauty in that. And there is something that is to celebrate about that. But the challenge of that is that you can't standardize it and you can't claim it. When you think about the originality of American cuisines, true American cuisines, at least 3 or 4 stems, particularly from Black culture, right? Low country, you think about Southern, and then Creole, for example. You cannot talk about that without claiming and thinking about African American heritage. Then for me, it's also you add in barbecue that has many, many people having a hand in it, but particularly African American culture. Well, we have not, documentation is a big part of how we move forward and claim. And I think when I think about African American contribution to music, for example, right, it's clear what era of gospel, what era of jazz, what era of hip hop, what era of R&B, what era of funk. It's so clear. And hopefully one day Black cooking can look at the same way. So claiming it, the authorship, creating memories, and creating a level of desire and aspiration is key. Osayi, what are some of the stories that you feel should really be highlighted in the book that, what are some of the hidden gems in the book that we should talk about, Osayi?
I hate picking.
You don't have to pick. It's okay.
But, well, we talked about Charleston, Therese, you talked about studying in Charleston, and I think that's a really interesting example to draw from. You mentioned Low Country, Marcus. I just had this thought of like, how incredible would it be to be a young aspiring cook or chef and be in a culinary school program led by BJ Dennis, right? Someone who we profile in the book and who many of you probably have, you follow on Instagram. If you don't, you should. He is, I wrote about Alexander Smalls in Food and Wine recently, and I referenced BJ Dennis as an emerging master of Gullah Geechee cuisine, and he's really one of the, he's a griot. He is, I think, I don't know if he would approve of this, but I think he's kind of like just like the people's historian, right? He's there on the ground, tasting the food, listening to the stories, looking at the structural impacts of what we're talking about here. People with declining access to land, talking about these traditions that, and understanding that decline doesn't just happen naturally. It's a function of systemic policies that oppress Black people and limit access to resources that enable, one of the clearest pathways to wealth in this country, which is, ownership of land. He's someone who, took the stories of his grandfather and, the recipes. This area, in the Southeast United States, was geographically somewhat hard to get to for some time. And so that allowed the descendants of the African people who were brought to this region specifically for the purpose of cultivating rice, because they were already doing that on the other side of the Atlantic. It really allowed them to maintain and protect some of the traditions that, for many other people through the domestic slave trade and many other factors that kind of helped erase and minimize African tribal and African nation traditions. We were able to protect those things a bit more. And so there's a continuity that is accessible there that escapes some other parts of the country. And he was able to draw a through line between the things that he'd heard about and that he had eaten and seen as a boy and as a very young cook. And he went to the Caribbean. And I think one of the things I'm most interested in, as Therese said, as we get more specific, as we become more interested in bringing more regionality to our conversations around African American, Black cooking. I'm really interested to see more exploration of the Caribbean influence, and we're talking about over 30 nations and territories, so it's a lot of diversity there. But he went to the Virgin Islands and cooked there and saw like this is my people's food. Like what's going on over here, right? So his story is fascinating to me for the self ordainedness of it. I think that's what you're talking about too. You know when something isn't right. You know when it's not sitting right. And we've all had this experience, I'm sure, in some way, but I think for a lot of Black people, for myself, it was sitting in English classes, at UCLA, where I started off as an English major. I didn't finish as one. I ended up changing my major. But, it was very confusing to me to be in the United States, having to study very wonderful writers, Joyce and Chaucer and Milton and all these folks. And I had to wade through all these courses, all these European writers before I had the elective opportunity to study someone like Octavia Butler or Toni Morrison. And we see that reflected throughout all of our discourses. It's an incredibly narrow field that the white dominant institutions have permitted certain people and certain narratives to lay claim to the traditions that we choose to follow. So I think, in BJ's story, what we see is that self-determination of saying, something is not right here. I'm not learning the whole story. And so he has used, the scholarship of people that we've mentioned, including David Shields, who is, I think, a wonderful scholar and a treasure to American culture and American foodways, to back up what he feels, what he's seeing, what he's hearing from these stories that have been passed down generationally. That's just one example of, I think, the depth that these are short profiles. I don't want people to get the wrong idea, but it gives you an opportunity. It's the sum of all these stories and all these recipes together that really start to allow you to realize, wow, there's a lot here that I don't know. Why don't I know that? Who lied to me, right? Like, that's where you start.
Well, then you brought up the BJ thing though, because like BJ to me he's Vermeer, right? Like he's Vermeer Grosvenor. He's sort of that bombast, like that. Like why do I need permission to talk about and to sort of hold precious my culture, and also this sort of making your presence conditional, right? Like he shows up in space fully formed and so empowered by culture that you have to contend with culture when you enter the room. And I think that's the kind of energy I want to take it to 2021. I want us to be so full-throated about from where we come that we make our presence conditional.
I think also with all the work that we do as Black culinarians, I think always about the thought process and then the experience people will have, but also what's going to come out of this, right? So the two things that I know what's going to come out of the rise is just as important as what went into the rise. When I started Red Rooster, I was constantly thinking about what's going to come out of Red Rooster from a guest experience, but also from the staff experience and the decade trade of that. I worked at the Red Rooster. I was part of the rise, even when we did Harlem Meet Up, right? Like these experiences is something to build on. And when you said that there's something wrong here, that cannot be the norm. And sometimes you just get dumbed down to accepting a norm that shouldn't be the norm. And I think where one of the things that I love the most about the book is that this is not a list. This is not a Michelin guide. You made the list or you didn't make the list. There's a lot of incredible people that is not in the rise. It could be 5 the rise. It's more a showcase, a broader showcase of here is part of our incredible tribe and incredible contributors to American food scene. You should know. And if it's locally around you or next time you go to that city, go and visit, go and support, The two things that I hope we can build, well, I know we will build from the rise, is a residence program, right? So that's the next step of the rise, that 1 or 2 chefs can go away for a month or 2 and reflect and document and come back to us and present work the way you do if you were a student at the Studio Museum of Harlem, right? If you worked with Thelma Golden, for example. And I look at the incredible generation of Black artists that has come out of that. So that was strategic, right? The Glenn Lygens, the Lorna Simpson, the Sanford Biggers, the Candy Wiley, Derek Adams, the list goes on and on and on. But they were all had an aspirational program to get to. They got cultivated, and then they presented back work. And now they're out in the world. And we have this incredible fluorescent talent pool that hopefully we can create a residence program. The other program that the Rise has been able to be part of and also being able to create is that a fund called Black Businesses Matching Fund. We're being able to raise money for Black businesses throughout COVID, for example, because there's ever a time where Black entrepreneurship is in danger of locally being underserved or undersupported is now, right? So Therese, can you explain a little bit about how your journey from cooking to creating your platform to how did you know that that was right for you? Because I do think people understand a path that I'm a chef and I'm going to be a chef and here's my restaurant and I open a restaurant, close a restaurant. That's a traditional path, but your path, tell us about your journey a little bit deeper.
Sure. Like I said, I got to a place in my mid-20s where I think I feel like in the culinary space, culinary school happens, you get your first couple jobs and you're trying to figure out who you are and what kind of work you want to do going forward. And I was in the midst of sort of the first sort of big hump in my work. I was running a catering company with 3 other partners. We had sold 2 books to Simon & Schuster. We were the business was sort of evolving, but it was 2008 and it was, a presumptive Obama presidency, but it also was the downturn of 08. And a lot of the plans that we had for early 09 just got obliterated. It was very much like this moment. And I met, 20-something, making the first big adult choice in my work. And I realized that I really was not fortified by much. My foundations were a little shaky. And they were shaky because I wasn't really, I wasn't asking intuitive questions. And I also just wasn't, I don't know what I was beholden to exactly. I think I was part of an emerging industry where the gaze of people's imagination onto Blackness, onto Black culture, we were sort of the generation where sort of brands were figuring out that Black folks actually purchase books and we were interested in dining. And what was I going to say in the midst of that? I didn't know better. I was subscribing to this sort of narrow, monolithic Blackness. And I was shamed. I was shamed that I didn't know more, that I hadn't touched taste since culinary school, that I wasn't entrenched in a way that was worthy of Vernon Grossman and beholden to and Lewis. And I need to know more for myself. And I think any problem for me, I only go by what I can personally get done. So I sent this letter to 40 folks that I knew about the reason separation, Black folks in food. Isn't there more? Is there, what are we doing here? If I'm 20 something and having this crisis of conscience, should we not all be in, especially folks who were much farther along in their careers, just was asking for advice. It wasn't a condemnation or anything. It just was this place of, this has to be more. There has to be more to this than just subscribing to whatever this is. And it started to resonate, right? It was sort of social networking beginning to become a thing. And really this idea of how do you model community? How do you model community that is historically accurate, right? Because the more you start to know, right, you can't unlearn the legacy of Georgia Gilmore. You can't unknow Vernon Grossman. You can't be unaffected by the legacy of someone like Leah Chase. Mrs. Chase was in her restaurant till the very end. She understood that her presence in that restaurant was a public trust. It was not just about being a restaurateur. It was about being the keeper of tradition in a way that was visible and front facing. And it is a very different thing than the mechanism of a restaurant. And so, I don't know, the last 5 years especially, it's like an embarrassment of riches, right? Like, I remember when High on the Hog came out. For me, that was it was a beacon, right? It was, Dr. Harris had told us in '86 in Hot Stuff that we were going to have to contend with the African diaspora. But High on the Hog was this perfectly framed foundation. It was this it's an easy book to read. I hope you need to get this book because it gives you these 12 chapters that tells this linear story that it makes you wonder, right? And you have to go down this rabbit hole. And then when you layer on other books, right? You layer on Tony Tipton Martin, right? You layer on Michael Twitty. You layer on all of these. I mean, the last decade of books has been this renaissance, right? This is the Black arts movement. This is the Harlem Renaissance. We are in the midst of a time where we have the words to give to young people. If I had these books when I was 18, if I had a community of chefs who felt emboldened and empowered in that way, my work would look a lot different. And I feel like this is what this moment is. My site is really just about a starting place, right? Like, I thought about, especially when I first started, I thought if at 26 or 27, if I was having this trouble finding those points of inspiration, certainly an 18-year-old was. And if you could just have a place, right? Just here's a book you should check out.
Yeah.
Here's some video. You're on YouTube anyway. Here are videos you should be watching. It's literally just a starting point because you can't unknow it. You are literally infused and it gets into your marrow.
I love that. I feel like, we're in a time where the U.S. election was literally like carried by Black women,
Literally.
And when I look at the rise, I also go back to Black women, right? Some are very known. Talked about Miss Edna Lewis and Sylvia Woods and Miss Leah Chase, that all three of them were activists, chefs, restaurateurs, community leaders. If you wanted the Black vote in New Orleans, you went to Leah's restaurant. If you had the meeting, Rosa Parks, a lot of it was planned at Dookie Chase. But also, like, if you wanted to see incredible Black art, like Romar Bearden or Leah carried that too. So it's clear to me that these incredible women were not just restaurant owners, they were community leaders, they were activists, they were in many ways part of Black Lives Matter before Black Lives Matter in a different way. They were part of the movement. And same goes in the rise. I wanted to focus a lot on the contribution specifically about Black women to food in America. But say, like, why is it 2020 that story is undertold, do you think? What is
that? It's not the story people have wanted to tell. I mean, it's a huge question, and I think it's one that we're kind of newly contending with, as we see some of the demographic breakdowns from this recent election. What I take from it is that we really struggle as a country giving credit to Black women, and we see that from a lot of demographics, but we see that mostly from white leaders, white kind of gatekeepers. And I think that has something to do with a very long lens of framing and where we have situated Black women as an archetype. And, I don't think I have to like beat this too heavily on people's heads. You can look at casting and in movies and films, you can see this. in how Black women's music gets discussed. You know, you can see this in many different ways. You know, in the fashion industry. You know, how people are modeled and styled. I mean, you know, there are many touch points to kind of start to understand this. But I think if you start to tell the story of the debt that we owe to our, you know, the forebears as Black women, I stopped using the term founding fathers. Just like I don't speak about enslaved people who identified as some, you know, tribe or nation. You know, we call them African in a general statement now, but, you know, those were not people who were slaves. Those were enslaved Africans. They were enslaved Americans. So I don't say founding fathers anymore. And I haven't really come up with a term that feels right to me, but, you know, it's kind of a bunch of charlatans, right? A bunch of salesmen, some really great ideas, some really beautiful writing, and some diabolical beliefs and rationalizations that allowed them to dehumanize people, you know, whose bodies they abused, sometimes, you know, directly. I don't lend credit to that. I think, you know, we need to talk more about the founding mothers. And of course, you know, there's a huge component of this conversation that must incorporate the indigenous people who are the stewards of this land first. You know, we are always, always, always on indigenous land. And there's a greater conversation that I think is happening and will continue to happen. Specifically, I see Soulfire Farm, you know, reflecting on, you know, we will never really achieve the equity we want to see in land for Black people if we cannot also include the conversation around the land that our ancestors were forced to shepherd. So I think that, you know, as long as we are looking in our present moment and we're uncomfortable recognizing the expertise, the ingenuity, the innovation, the value that should be ascribed to Black women, no matter what they look like, no matter what shape they are in, and not necessarily even just the high achieving ones, right? But, you know, the ones who are invisible to so many, the ones who are doing all the labor, the ones who I see pushing all these white babies and strollers around Prospect Park on Tuesday afternoons, like those women too, right? You know, until we're able to recognize their greatness, it's going to be continually very difficult for us to look back and reflect on so many of the unnamed women who, you know, nursed white babies, who you know, cooked that food, who kept those oral traditions of recipes alive at threat of losing life or limb if they dared learn how to read or reveal that they knew how to read. I mean, we're talking about just an incredible, multifaceted system of social and legal oppression that continues and has evolved to this day. So I think, you know, those are some of the reasons. I don't know if I fully answered the question, but threw a lot out there.
Great. No, that's amazing. And we're about to start Q&A, but so I just think that there's one question around some of those unsung heroes. Therese, can you, like, in a really quick way, explain about Club of Nowhere, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Georgina a little bit, just for people who might not know? Because I just think that, or Club Nowhere with contribution to Martin Luther King and the movement, and Saphir Wright that worked with Lyndon B. Johnson, you know, we're in the middle of dealing with the election. Like, those are just two quick examples of how Black women part of changing the conversation in America, really, really quickly before we start Q&A.
Sure. So Zephyr Wright was Lyndon B. Johnson's personal cook. She was one of those women. I think sometimes we talk about these domestic workers, these domestic women that, you know, Miss Lewis was singular, but there were many, many Miss Lewises all around the country. And Zephyr Wright, because she was so close proximally to the president, had his ear, and the injustices she was experiencing were visible to him. It was not, you know, the power feeding people gave her proximity to the president, and a lot of his policies sort of around racial equity and justice are attributed to her being front facing, you not being able to sort of, you can't unsee the fact this woman is experiencing your lack of action. And I mean, that's a really particular way of framing what at the time was probably very simple conversations that she was having. And you know, he gets credit for seeing her humanity, and I'm sure that's something you should get credit for. But I mean, if policies get enacted because you finally see the tangible reality of racism, then that's a win. But I think of her more as this hero in the way that there was so many of her, so many women like her around the country who were using the skills that they had generationally, bequeathed skills that get dismissed all the time. And then Judge Gilmore was, she was one of the founders of the Club from Nowhere. I mean, you talk about plate economies, you talk about, you know, sort of subversive non-restaurant spaces. The Club from Nowhere is a prime example of it. The bus boycotts were no one expected them to last over a year. You know, there was just this sense that there's this movement that has to happen. But your point about women and being unsung heroes is that it took those women who understood organizing, who were organizing their church breakfasts and dinners, and were in these jobs that, you know, organize hundreds of meals every day. It took that kind of organization to sort of see the power of fundraising. And the fundraising we don't have the longevity of those bus boycotts without the Club from Nowhere. We don't have the longevity without them sort of understanding the inherent riskiness of forming these kinds of organizations and being able to be covert about it, and, you know, just organize in a way that I'm sure that the men around them were unequipped to be. So yeah, they get credited with, they're unsung heroes in that we don't talk about their contribution, but yeah, I mean, they're why we had this kind of grassroots foundational organization in those movements.
Thank you for sharing that. It's amazing. Sorry, I know we're behind. Come on.
You're good. You're good. I mean, I wish we could talk all night about this. I also forgot to mention at the top of the show that I just want to shout out Sisters Uptown Bookstore, our partner on this program. Black-owned bookstore in Manhattan. If you bought the Rise with your ticket, it supported Sisters Uptown, which is great. And I'm going to send you all the link tomorrow. So if you didn't buy it yet, you can buy it tomorrow, and I'll send you the link so you can buy it from Sisters. And I also was remiss to mention that Mofad's upcoming exhibition, which did not open on time because of the pandemic, is African/American Making the Nation's Table. It's an entire exhibition that celebrates that contribution, making the argument that African-American food is American food. So coming to these programs supports us so we can open that exhibition once it's safe to do so. We're hoping that happens in spring. So thank you all so much for this conversation. Some questions that are coming up. Therese mentioned she wished she had the network of knowledge she had today, which is why she went and created it herself. For each of you, what media or video or book or article would you say was the most transformative for you personally, for each of you?
Dr. Osayi, do you want to jump in?
I'll go last.
I'll start. I mean, for me, especially now, I'm revisiting Verneri Grosvenor a lot recently. I've heard Thursdays and Every Other Sunday Off is a book that everybody needs to get their hands on immediately, because she talked about where we place our values. She called it a domestic rap, and that book is some of the most gangster, she was so particular about seeing Black women and seeing domestic workers as the heroes of the food space, and how we dismissed them offhand. And she was saying this in 72. So I feel like it's a shame that her words are just as timely now, but I mean, Renee had the words for us, so yeah.
I would say for me, the day when my father gave me Alex Haley, Malcolm X. You know, I always wanted to write and do something that the books that I wanted to see. And as a young Black chef, the norm was, of course, there's not a Black cookbook. That was just accepted. And I was like, this is, and so he talked about it a little bit like before, who lied, right? And these were these constant moments in food when you realize, I'm not French, I like the techniques from France, but there's got to be something more. And once I started to travel, I saw Southeast Asia, I saw other aspects of Europe, and I came to America. And then eventually, as you start to read, you realize you got to write your own history. And you know, Leah Chase, one of Leah Chase's books called Still I Cook. And seeing Edna's books, seeing Leah's books, and seeing that there was still opportunities to write your journey as a young chef coming up. But I think Jessica Herrick's books really helped me see that Africa mattered in a way, because both Edna's and Leah's books talks a lot about the African American Southern experience. But what Jessica Harris does, she really links it back to the continent and the Caribbean in a way that is so important, especially for me being African. So I would say Jessica's books combined with Malcolm, and still saying to yourself, whoever you are, come up with the book that you are missing, whatever that speaks to you. Just write the blog that you are not seeing, and write the piece that you haven't read, and just be authentic to that. And then the incredible moment we're in right now is that there's more avenues to document your work, which it wasn't before. That's the beauty about internet and social media, that you can start something and then that can lead up to a traditional, if that's what you want it to be, or you may not. And those are the options that we have in America today. And that's incredible. You have to document it, because otherwise it happened, but it's hard to claim our history. Even when it is documented, it's even harder if it's not documented. So, see?
Gosh, I think I will say that some of the most transformative work for me, when I first started kind of thinking around, you know, Black identity as it relates to how we tell our stories, was reading James Baldwin. And, you know, like Therese, I felt, you know, stunned that I had not known who he was until I got to college. And that was the first time that I had Black instructors. You know, my professors were Black after an entire public school education in California, one of our most diverse states, you know, never having been instructed by an African-American person. And when I was reading, I think anything by James Baldwin, we'll get to there, but, you know, there's something around, I think there's something to be said for this sense of kind of like, you're just a little personally, like, I don't know that you identify it as shame or kind of like embarrassment, like at the time, you know, like when you're 20, but there is this sense of like, how did I not know about this, right? I mean, my family was very instructive. I had a lot of resources, a lot of materials, but that just was something that had not, I hadn't connected with. And, you know, we're still exploring Baldwin, right? I mean, he wasn't really, I mean, he was a firebrand at the time, but I think, you know, what we're starting to understand now is that, you know, a lot about him, a lot of his contributions were overlooked because he did not necessarily fit the mold of what certain leaders in the civil rights movement wanted spearheads to be, you know, as a gay man, a very brash man, not really concerned with your feelings, man. And so we're seeing new explorations of his book. Just this year, Eddie Glaude Jr. published Begin Again, which has been all over the media. If you haven't seen it, you're hiding from news because it's been everywhere. And that's, I think, one example of how rich and textured and just full of aliveness these incredible figures are and have been. I would love to see, you know, Frederick Douglass treated, you know, the way Hamilton was, you know, lionized, you know, and that's the person who I think really deserves to be lifted up and seen, and having kids, you know, like think about it and reflect on that being a founding father. How about that? So, you know, I say James Baldwin, there's so many others, but I think, you know, there's resources in this book, you know, we direct you to, but when it comes to, you know, the canon of African-American literature, there's always something that has been hidden from you. So no matter where you start, I would encourage you just to pick up a book, and, you know, you'll end up figuring out where to go next.
Thanks, Osayi. Thank you for all of your answers to everyone. We have a question from Davida Davison, speaking of amazing Black women. Just when Davida's in the house, you know, I feel so honored. So I'm going to read her question and I think that'll take us out tonight. So Davida is reading Martha S. Jones's new book, Vanguard: How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote. Thank you, Black women, and insisted on equality for all. Is there a story about Black women and the legacy of food and protest that has not been told? I don't know. Therese, you want to start?
So, protest specifically, I'm unsure that I know of any. I feel like I'm thinking of people like Psyche Forson, like building houses. I think talks about the agency women will find it in food spaces, and that's close but not quite. I feel like, again, like Georgia Gilmore, we sort of canonize her or sort of put her in this really particular box. But I would love, I mean, it's like sort of the bookshelf that you want to write or want to sort of see. You know, what would it look like? I mean, I think about Imani Perry's Looking for the Rain. Like this was a sort of biography, but in analysis form, where you're really sort of using the figure as a archetype and sort of talking through the larger impact that people maybe didn't see or missed. So it would be really interesting. I think sort of rethinking the club from nowhere, but sort of extrapolating out. That'd be really interesting. Come on, publishers.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
Osayi has a few things to say about that.
No, I won't go there now. But yeah, I don't know of a particular story, but I think that just means that, you know, we don't know, but someone probably does, and it's probably, you know, something that has been documented somewhere. I mean, that to me, one of the most exciting things about this particular book is that I think there are like 300 or 400 books in this book, right?
Yeah.
And I want publishers to get that. I want, you know, assigning editors to understand that. And I want, you know, readers, no matter what your background is, to understand how truncated we have made this history, and that it just deserves more and more expansion. And we're starting to see that, you know, in the regionality and focus of people like Hawa Hassan in her book that came out a week before ours, In BB's Kitchen. It's absolutely one you should also get from Sisters Uptown, where she looks at the food made by grandmothers in the 8 countries that touch the Indian Ocean on the African continent, or Yewande Komolafe, our recipe developer, who's working on her own book that is inspired from Lagos, right? So we're starting to understand that just like, you know, we have regions in Italy that have different food cultures, and we have regions in China that have different food cultures. So too do we have a vast, you know, plethora of experiences and tastes that come from people who, you know, might fall under the category of African. So I think it's just a matter of time before a story like that, Davida, related to, you know, protesting and food, that emerges. And, you know, that's, you know, can you imagine, like, I mean, not to like bring everything to like a commercial standpoint, but I feel like that's how we understand, you know, we know about hidden figures, we know about Katherine Johnson because someone wrote a book and because someone made a movie. That doesn't happen every single time, but that's when you start to see it mirrored back. Because there's a way that you start to feel like, you know that it was like the father figure in my Big Fat Greek Wedding, and he was always like, "That's Greek," you know, and like, you know, it would be like, "Oh, I'm so embarrassed." And you start to kind of feel that way, but it's like, no, like it's not just, you know, a wives' tale. It's not just, your crazy dad telling you. My dad is Nigerian, right? I would always hear that. Oh, African people, da da da. I never. But like when I watch TV, when I watch TGIF, when I went to school, that was not mirrored for me, right? So, there was a way that I kind of undermined my father, even as a child. I didn't really believe him. So, this gives us some ammunition to continue this conversation, which has already been had, but we're keeping it present, we're keeping it potent, we're seeing that we have new avenues to explore. And, I hope that we'll continue doing that, with food.
Well, I would like to bring it back to the continent, because one of the things to think about privileges, even at a very, very difficult time, the beauty about, even at this election, you see the worst in us, but you also see the best in us. And America is this beacon. And when I think about that, how that relates to Blackness and cookbooks, I think about a couple of places. I know right now at this moment, through food, there are women, there are men, there are fundraising, and Legos going on right now for SARS. It happens through food. I know right now in Ethiopia, as we struggle with all the back and forth, and hopefully civil rights war is not going to happen in Ethiopia. Hopefully we solve it peacefully. But food is part of that. And most of them are women that are cooking, staying up overnight. I know through just speaking to Desmond Tutu that food and fundraising was a major part of the ANC's movement and how we gathered food for Nelson Mandela. So what I've learned about our incredible journey as Black people is that just when I opened Red Rooster, the best food in our culture was not in restaurants. If I wanted to know how to make the best cornbread, I had to go to a smaller church and meet Miss Mabel, and she showed me at her house. If I wanted to know how to do the best jerk chicken, it was at the park, not at a pop-up. It was just a place where Miss Tiffany posted up every other Saturday. So our beauty and our brilliance is in the community and of the community, but it's harder to find. It's actually the birthplace of cool and real. And even as I think about my own mother, my birth mother, Anu, from Ethiopia, that cooked in a hidden way. The food that she brought with us when she walked us into the hospital for days was all dried food. And she decided for us to eat at night because it was too warm to walk during the day. And in order for her to preserve the food, it had to be dried food. So the very specific journey of heroes and women and Black women, and some food will be documented, but it doesn't mean that civil rights movement hasn't happened and they haven't been documented. We just haven't put a worth on it. And what I love about Jessica Harris' work, Tony Tipton Martin's, Edna Lewis, and Leah Chase, they set a path, and many more set a path for us to document our work so we can create worth. The next generation, the Tiana G's in the book, the Patricia Gonzalez in the book that is 19 years old, right, has a path. And she knows that she has to document her journey. All of that is why I think The Rise Matters, Osayi's book, someone like Rodney Scott's incredible barbecue book that is about to come out, Mashama Bailey's book that is coming out Jan 10th or something like that. Adrian Miller has a book about barbecue also coming up, and the list goes on and on and on and on. So thank you, Mofad, for giving us the platform. Thank you to everybody that tuned in. Thank you, Therese Nelson. Thank you, Osayi, for everything. And I really feel privileged to be part of this incredible community. Thank you.
Thank you, Chef. We are so, so privileged to have you. Congratulations to you and to Osayi on your beautiful book. Thank you for this conversation tonight. It is always such a privilege to amplify Black voices and just reiterate that Black lives matter, Black food matters. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. Therese, thank you for being with us. Thank you for talking about your journey. And everyone, I will email you tomorrow with links to blackculinaryhistory.com, which is such a remarkable resource, and exactly what Marcus was saying about preserving the legacy. That is like your first stop. So I will also send links to all the books that we talked about tonight, and obviously go out and get the rides if you haven't yet. And thank you again for supporting us and sticking with us throughout all this. We are so grateful for you. We do have one program I wanted to mention at the end of the month, which is all about Indigenous food sovereignty, actually, too. So in our version of celebrating Thanksgiving, we'll be lifting up Indigenous voices, and we'll be doing cooking demos and talking about that. So I will send you links tomorrow. Thank you so much. Good night. Take care, everyone. Wear your masks.
Wear your mask.